Hi, I'm Matt from Build That Website, and in today's video we're going to be transforming this hideous mess into a gorgeous card design in a fully responsive grid layout. And we're going to do it thanks to an amazing property of CSS called Display Grid. Now if you want to learn more about CSS Grid, first subscribe to the channel obviously, but also I've linked some of my favorite resources in the video description where you can really get up to speed fast with Grid and start using it in your own projects. Alright, let's get started.
All right, this is a pretty generic archive page, and I feel your pain if this is what yours looks like, because I've been there before. And essentially we have each post in its own little container here. My featured images aren't quite large enough, so they're not stretching the full width of the container here. And it's just a list of posts basically. And what we want to do is transform this into a grid, and it literally takes 2 lines of CSS code. So let's zoom in a little bit so you can see this better. And what you're going to do, it's going to be slightly different on your theme, but we're going to inspect the code and we need to choose the correct element to target here. So in either Chrome or Firefox, you want to right click basically anywhere on the page and choose inspect. And let's just right click at the top of the page here and click inspect. We want to find the wrapper element that's wrapped around each one of our posts. So in my case, it's this article element. And if you scroll down, you can see that this, and you hover over it, you can see that it stops around the border of the article. And if we sort of collapse this and go to the next one, you can see this is the next article and so on. So we want to find the immediate parent that is containing all these article elements. In my case, it's this container called main, which has an ID of main and a class of site main. So we want to write our CSS rules to turn this into a grid. So the first thing you want to do is, because this class or this element might be reused on other pages of your site, we want to make sure these styles only apply to your category page, or at least the correct page that you want to target these rules to. Now, if you are using WordPress and you're on an archive page like I am, then WordPress adds this archive body class to every archive page. So we can make sure that these rules only get targeted to the archive page and not single posts, for example. So I'm going to start my rule and I'm going to say archive as the outside class to make sure the rules are targeted properly. And then we're going to use the ID main. So that's a # because it's an ID. And we'll open our brackets here. And the first rule we want to say is display grid. And that allows us to specify a grid for this container. Now CSS Grid offers really complex layouts, and you could like specify exact track sizes and like reposition elements anywhere you want in the grid, but we don't want to do that here. We don't need to do that here. What we're going to do is automatically create a grid that is filled in no matter how many posts you have, and it becomes instantly responsive based on the screen size. And that's literally one more line of CSS code. We're just going to say grid template columns, and our rule is going to be repeat auto fit, comma, min max, parentheses, and then we're going to set the minimum size that we want for a grid item to be. So we might say 320 pixels, for example, is the smallest our grid item can get. And the largest it can get, we want it to be 1 FR. And you don't really have to know what an FR is, but essentially it's 1 unit of fractional remaining space in the grid. The minimum size of a column is 320 pixels wide. The maximum size of a column is 1 FR, or essentially the full width of the row. And you can already see that something's happened. And if we scroll up here, voila, we have a grid. That's amazing. Now, currently there's no gaps between our grid items. You can see that there's no real space between them. So one more rule we can put in here is grid gap, and we could say 20 pixels. And now that puts these gutters between each of our grid items. And before we go any further, let me just show you that this is in fact working. Now I'm in the responsive mode for Chrome Inspector, and you can see as I collapse the page, the grid auto resizes. It goes from a 3-column grid to a 2-column grid, and as we get smaller, it's going to go to a 1-column grid automatically. Okay, so the hard work is already done. This is already looking fantastic. But let's just fix a couple more issues that I have with my layout. Now, the first problem we have is that the category header is actually getting pulled into the grid, and that's not something we want. And that probably won't happen on most of your themes, but unfortunately my theme actually puts this header in the same container as all the posts. And I would say maybe that's bad practice, but what we want to do is we're going to make this header take up a full row so it looks like it's not in the grid at all. So we're going to right click and inspect this element. And what we want to target is this element right here because it's the direct descendant of the element that we made a grid. So we want to target the header class page header. So we want to use the same wrapper class again, archive main, and we'll say page header. It's a class, so we're going to put a period in front of it. And our rule is simply going to be grid column. And this is telling it what column to place this element into in our grid. And we're going to say 1/-1. So essentially it spans the entire row. That's what this rule does. And you can see it's now been pulled out of the flow and is spanning the entire row of the grid. And now our posts are lining up perfectly below it. Next up, this is particular to my theme. You might not have this issue, but you can see that these postcards are different sizes for some reason. And that shouldn't be happening. In a grid, every element in a row should fill the full height of the row. So something else is going on. And if we just right click here and inspect, let me choose the next one. You can see the article is actually full height. It's just this intersection isn't the full height. And so what we just need to do is target this class here and make it the full height of its parent. So we're just going to grab these wrapper classes again. We're going to target the class inside article, and we're just going to say height 100%. So it's going to be as tall as this container. And now you can see our grid is lining up perfectly. Now, what if you want to adjust this grid? What if you don't want a 3x3 grid to start? And you may need to adjust the card size based on the width of your template. So if, for example, you wanted a 4-column grid, you can just adjust this to maybe be 220 pixels is the minimum. And now if it can fit 4 cards side by side, it will. Now, if you want a 2-column grid, you could make this 400 pixels, for example, and now we'll have a 2-column grid. So all you have to do is play around with these values to get things to look the way you want. For example, you could just widen the gap between the posts to make it look a bit more natural if you have a larger grid. Okay. All right, I'm going to go back to the 3-column grid that I had set up. Now, one last thing is if you want to target your blog page also, not just your archive pages, we need to tweak these rules a little bit, because if I go back to the site and go to my main blog page here, you can see that it still has the original layout. This is the home page of my site, but it's also the blog page of my site, and you might have a separate blog page. In either case, your theme is going to add the class blog to the body. And so all we have to do is duplicate these styles, but also use it for the .blog class, not just the .archive class. So we can copy this rule. We're just going to put a comma. So these rules apply to also the second selector. And we're just going to replace this with blog and do the same thing here, blog. And we can do the same thing again here. And now these styles are applying to both pages. If we go to the archive page again, the styles are still there, but basically we just told these selectors to be targeting 2 locations on our site to apply these same rules. Now, the heavy lifting is done. Your archive page is all set up in terms of the layout of the cards. What's next to do is we want to actually style these cards to make them look exactly how we want, to create a custom look for your website and really make it pop off the page. So the first step here is we need to get the right classes to target. So I'm going to inspect our elements here. And we could either target the article class itself or this inside article class. They both have the same outer border. And which one you target will depend on your theme. Some themes use this outer wrapper to actually create spacing between them. So you need to find the correct class to target. But I'm just going to use the inside article class. So for my rule, I'm going to go .archive. The second tier of my selector is going to be this ID main, which is sort of the immediate parent of this post grid. And finally, I'm going to be targeting the inside article class, which is this right here. So let's start writing some rules. First off, I'm going to give it a border 1 pixel solid, and we're going to do a lightish gray. Now, by default, these are rectangular. And if you want sort of a softer rounded card look, you could give it a border radius. So we could say border radius 8 pixels as a border radius. Now you'll notice maybe that on the bottom here, we have a border radius, but on the top around the image, it didn't actually do anything. And that's because the image is overflowing the container because the image is rectangular. It doesn't have border radius. And instead of adding border radius to the image, we're just going to skip a step and just go overflow hidden, which means that anything that is outside this container is all of a sudden hidden. And now we got these nice rounded corners at the top. The next thing I want to do is make sure that these featured images are all the same size. One of my pet peeves is when you have a card and the featured images are different heights. And you don't have to fix this in your theme. We can actually fix this completely with CSS. And we're going to be using a relatively new property, which is the aspect ratio property. So to get the correct selector, we're going to just inspect, right click and inspect. And we're going to be targeting this post image class, which contains this image right here. So we're going to grab our same wrapper classes just to make sure our rules are targeted properly again. And we're going to be targeting the post image class inside of that. And again, yours is probably going to be different for your theme if you're not using generatepress like I am. And actually, we want to target the image element inside of that post image class. Let's just write an aspect ratio rule. So let's try aspect ratio. And then just like a monitor or a television, you can just say 16 by 9 or something. And now you can see all our images are the same heights. But you might also be noticing that the image is actually getting squished. So it's sort of been vertically compressed, but the width hasn't been adjusted accordingly. And so we need to add one more rule, and that is object fit. We're going to say cover. And when it does that, now it allows the image to sort of move outside the container. Anything that is cropped off gets moved outside and is sort of hidden. And now there's no distortion. The image is the same proportions as the original image. There's no distortion in the image. All right, let's zoom out to take a peek at our cards here and see how they're going to appear sort of in real world circumstances. I think they're looking pretty good. A couple things to note is if you're going to be 3 wide and you have sort of narrower cards like this, you're going to have really tall cards if you put the post excerpt in here. And I personally think that it looks better if you want the excerpt in to do a 2-column layout. So if you had something like that, the excerpt fits a lot better and the card isn't overly stretched in height. So if you did want to do a 3-column layout, you might want to remove the excerpt either with your theme, or we can do it with a bit of CSS. So let me show you how to do that. We'll just go back to our 3-column layout here. And if we inspect, you can find the element that is the excerpt. And in my case, is the entry summary. So we're just going to grab our wrapper class here and we'll say entry summary, and we'll say display none. So it removes it entirely. It's as if that element wasn't even in the document. And now the proportions of our cards, I think, look a lot better. All right, now let's adjust the layout of the card itself. I want to do a little bit of styling, but specifically, I also want to make a footer for this card where the metadata is always in the same place in the footer instead of being a different position on the card based on how tall the content is above it. And to do that, we can do a grid for the card itself. So the grid targets any direct child element. So if we look at the card, we have these 4 elements: the post image, the title, the metadata, which is hidden. So let me unhide that. We have the sort of the excerpt and the entry meta. So we have 4 things, and then this is the parent element right here. So that's what we want to make a grid. We already have a rule that's targeting that element. If we look right here, we have our inside article that's being targeted by another rule. So we can just add our styles here. So first off, we're going to say display grid, and that made a slight adjustment. And now what we want to do is we want to set up the rows inside our grid. Right now, if we hover over this, you can see the lines, the purple grid lines. Now, it may look like this is already lined up our footer, but actually you can see that there's slight variation. And if we were to delete the content from one of these excerpts here, you can see that it's not actually working properly. So we need to define the rows for our grid and make sure that the bottom row gets pushed all the way to the bottom. So let me put that content back. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna set one of these elements, one of these 4 child elements, to stretch and fill up all the available space so that this gets pushed to the bottom. And depending on which elements you have in your card, it might be a different element that you want to stretch. If you're showing the excerpt, I would typically stretch the excerpt. And if I wasn't showing the excerpt, I might stretch the title to take up the extra space. So I'll show you how this works. And we can just say grid template rows. Let me just zoom in a little bit so you can see better. Grid template rows. And basically you set a row from top to bottom. So we're gonna need to set 4 rows. So the first one is gonna be auto, which is basically no change. It will fit its content. Then we're gonna say auto for the title as well. Then we're gonna say 1 FR for the excerpt. And that essentially stretches it to fill all the available space in the card. And now you can see that this is already fixed our layout. And we can just say auto for the metadata as well. And this should be an absolutely perfect layout. All right. If we were going to have that rule where we were hiding the entry summary, if we put back that rule, now our layout breaks again. And that's because we effectively only have 3 rows because it's as if this element doesn't exist. We just need to delete this rule here. And now the title is the one being stretched. And we have this footer that's working properly again. Now, next up, if you wanted, you might want to, for example, adjust the font size or color of our title here. And that's easy enough to do. You could just grab the class. And we want to make sure we have our wrapper too, to make sure that we're only targeting it on the archive page. So we'll say h2.entry title, and we could say font size 25 pixels, maybe 27, and font weight 600. And of course you could change the color or do whatever else you wanted. Now let's give our cards a hover effect so that it's obvious that they're clickable. So we're going to grab our wrapper again. And in fact, we're just going to grab this one because it's got the blog in it as well. So we don't have to type those styles in manually later. And the way we're going to change this rule is we're just going to say hover. We're going to put the hover pseudo class on that rule, and we have to put it here as well for the blog layout. And now we can set some hover styles. So one thing you could do on hover is add some box shadow. And we'll say 0 pixels, and then give it a blur of, let's try 20 pixels. And we can give it a color of RGB 0,0,0, which is black. Need to delete that space. And that's too dark, so we actually want to give it an opacity. So we're just going to put another comma, and I'll say like 0.1, which will make just this really subtle box shadow. Hopefully you can see it as we hover. And we could also change the border color. So just to help it stand out a bit more. If you want to animate this transition so it appears just a smidge more gradual, we can easily do that. And we're going to go up to this initial rule, not the hover state, but the standard state, and just say transition. We'll say all. We're going to make it apply to all properties. And we'll say 0.2 seconds. And now there's just this slight delay as it sort of scales in. And for just one more cool effect, we can actually make this image kind of zoom in as we hover over the card. So let's grab these styles again, this whole selector. But now this time we're going to target the images. So we need to put post image, targeting the image inside the post image div, and it's going to do the same thing here. That post image, and we're targeting the image there as well. And we can say transform, scale, which is going to make it larger. And we can just say 1.04. We'll try that. That makes it 4% bigger when you hover over, and you can see it zooming in. Now there's 2 things we need to fix. One, it's happening instantly. It's kind of jerky, and we want that smooth like zoom effect. And 2, it's actually making the image larger. You can see the bottom border of this image is lower than it is on the card beside it. So we need to hide that overflow. So let's add a couple more rules. And do we have a rule targeting the image already? No, we don't. So let's just copy this whole selector here. And we're just going to get rid of the hover class. So this is targeting the base state of the image. And we're going to say transition, transform. And we're going to say, I don't know, 0.2 seconds. And now it has this smooth zoom effect. And finally, we want to copy this rule one more time and delete the image tag. So we're targeting the container, that div that's wrapping around the image. And we just want to make sure that the overflow is being hidden so it doesn't go like so it doesn't actually move the image down. So we're just gonna say overflow hidden. And that still doesn't work. And that's because the div, the container, can still stretch to fit the size of its content. And so we need to force an aspect ratio on this container too. And we want to make it the same as the image. And so now if we force this aspect ratio of 16:9, now our rule works properly.
All right, if you made it this far, then you've managed to build a really cool responsive grid layout for yourself. Way to go! If you enjoyed this video, please give this a thumbs up. And if you have a suggestion for a future tutorial, please let me know in the comments down below, because I'm always looking for ideas. Now, if you're ready to keep on building right now, check out one of these videos right over here. See ya.